Everyone. I'm Sarah Burke, an associate publisher at The Nation. I just wanted to welcome everyone. You're a very accomplished group of editors, writers, and reporters, and we're so thankful for your work. And we're so thankful that you're all taking the time out of your lives to be here with us today. And we have about 100 attendees from coast to coast and everywhere in between, as well as Beirut, Brazil, India, Pakistan, Canada, and Japan. So I just wanted to walk everybody through a short logistical rundown about how today will work. For virtually every session, we'll devote ample time to your questions. I know this virtual format makes us feel a little distant, so please jump in the chat. Introduce yourselves to each other. You can respond to the conversation there, and you'll also want to submit any questions that you have for our speakers, and a moderator will be able to pass your questions along once you enter them in the chat. So please feel free to use the chat function throughout the day. We also have lots of small networking breaks and breakout sessions where you'll actually be able to be on camera and talk to the speakers, as well as meet all of the other attendees face to face. The breakout sessions at 3:30 are your chance to get to know each other in a small group and talk face to face with each other. So we've randomly selected about 7 or 8 people for each group. The idea here is for each person to talk a little bit, maybe about a recent project, an article, an interview, an investigation, or just an idea that you have with the group to offer feedback to each other, just like a virtual writing workshop, if you will. We'll also have Nation writers and staff stopping by each group to say hello and answer any questions. So in just a minute, one of my colleagues is going to post a link in the chat with a spreadsheet that contains a list of all of the breakout groups. So take a look at that and just find your name in the spreadsheet before 3:30. And at that time, you'll head to the area that you should see on the left side of your screen called Sessions, and you'll find your group name and enter. And you'll just be asked to enable audio and video when you join your group so that you can actually see and talk to your other attendees on video. And lastly, we have the editor of the Nation's student writing vertical called Student Nation here to meet you and answer your questions. Each year we have more than 100 student writers contribute articles to Student Nation, everything from first-person accounts of campus campaigns to coverage of legislative issues relevant to students and young people. So Sam Schuyler will be in a small session room in each of the networking breaks today. So if you would like to learn more about Student Nation and how to pitch ideas and articles to Student Nation, please head to the sessions area during those networking breaks to chat with Sam, and she'll answer any of questions that you have. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to the Nation's editorial director and publisher, Katrina vanden Heuvel, to talk more about the history of the Nation and the work that we do.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm not sure I could have followed all of that, but I want to thank all of you, accomplished media makers, independent media makers, for gathering with us today. You come, as Sarah said, from across this country, but also we have journalists from Brazil and Pakistan and Canada and the UK. So the virtual reality we live in has some advantages. Some of you oversee newsrooms larger than the Nation. We have the editor-in-chief of the Indiana Daily Student, Peter Rothberg, who helped organize this conference. We spent a great 2 days in Indiana. We sat in on an editorial meeting. It was so, we took lessons. I took notes for the Nation. We have the president of the Princeton Press Club, a club which rejected me when I was, so it's an extraordinary club, great history. I want to begin just offering great gratitude to the Puffin Foundation, to Neil and Gladys Rosenstein. Perry Rosenstein was a warrior for social justice, for a belief that in culture and in independent journalism, you could change the trajectory of this country and bend that arc toward justice. So we celebrate Puffin's enduring generosity. We're deeply grateful to them. Let me speak, as Sarah said, for a few minutes about the Nation, its history, its present, and bringing history to bear on this movement moment, and about our work today, some of the current writers' projects. The Nation has long focused on sustaining, covering, oxygenating movements. And, you're here for many reasons, I suspect, I believe, but I think one of them is you take movements seriously, the coverage of movements. So at this time of multiple intersecting crises, health, economic, racial justice, police brutality, at a time which cries out for a journalism that covers movements, holds the powerful accountable, and values a politics of insurgency, I think the nation is a place to come, as you have today, to hear from people who understand the practice of journalism in that way. We're living, I don't need to tell you, in times of promise and peril, of cruelty and kindness, of great social movements and hyper reactionary power. I don't know about you, but I wake some mornings, some days with despair, questioning why we do the work we do, how we become detectives for the people. What purpose is journalism when change seems so difficult, so hard, the forces arrayed so huge? But I know that I personally and my colleagues will not cease to do the work of a journalism working for change, using the pen or the pixel. And the nation has long, for 155 years, refused to cede to desperation or fear. And we try to hold reality and justice in a single vision. And I believe, as our longtime editorial board member, Toni Morrison, extraordinary writer, she wrote in our 150th anniversary issue, "This is precisely the time when writers and artists go to work. There's no time for despair, no place for self-pity, no need for silence, no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language. That is how civilizations heal." She continued, "I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it's important not to ignore its pain, it's also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art." The nation was founded in New York City in July 1865, 155 years ago. It was launched by abolitionists committed to ending slavery who believed in the power of the word. Not many magazines launch with a first line, quote, "The week was singularly barren of exciting events." I have not experienced such a week, and I will say that in these days, a day is a week or even a year in politics and in journalism. It's testament to the extraordinary writers and journalists who have written for the nation, fierce, fearless journalism, that I believe we've punched above our weight class in this time, in a tricky, fast-changing media landscape. I'm sure one which both engages you but vexes you as you look out at being a journalist. But unlike so much of our media, we believe you forget history at your peril. Instead, we bring history to bear. Think for a moment that in the 1960s, our civil rights correspondent for 6 years, from 61 to 67, was Martin Luther King Jr., who summoned the country to confront the brutal power which we see today in this unending struggle against racism, systemic racism. He summoned the country with nonviolent protest, the promise of a democracy, a real democracy. His prophetic words in our pages help bend the arc of that moral universe a little closer to justice. Today, I don't know if you know Reverend William Barber of North Carolina, who's at the forefront of voting rights as we speak. He is our civil rights correspondent, and he stands on King's shoulder as he relaunches the Poor People's Campaign and talks about militarism, systemic racism, ecological devastation. What's the sweet spot of surviving 155 years? I'd submit with humility its commitment to our mission, holding the powerful accountable, valuing rebellious voices and ideas, challenging the orthodoxies, conventional narratives, being willing to challenge, probing disruptive journalism, and while you're here, finding that next generation of journalism, of voices. Now you're going to meet a new generation today, former Nation interns, Zoe Carpenter, Liliana Segura, Allegra Kirkland, who's now with Vogue, Teen Vogue, and I'm proud that among the Nation's contributors, you're going to hear from Sasha Abramsky, Nation intern. And I think we also, we count among the Nation's contributors virtually every major American voice, international voice, that has spoken out for social, racial, economic justice, peace, civil liberties. I talked about King. I'll just, mention a few names. I mean, James Baldwin, Albert Einstein, Langston Hughes, Eleanor Roosevelt, Ralph Nader, Michael Moore, Naomi Klein, Alice Walker, Bill McKibben, Tony Kushner, Toni Morrison, who I quoted, Chris Hayes, who I asked to be our Washington editor at the age of 28, the inimitable Melissa Harris Perry, who you will meet, Michael Denzel Smith, Jeremy Scahill, Elie Mystal, who you will meet with, Dave Zirin, first sports correspondent of the nation, all wrote, and so many, of course, continue to write. And while we honor our history, we care deeply about nurturing, recruiting, introducing the nation to you, a next generation of readers, journalists, writers, activists, thinkers, and ensuring that, I was at a virtual kind of memorial yesterday for Wayne Barrett, whose coverage of Donald Trump, if we had read it in this country, we might have averted these last odious, toxic, dangerous years. And he died on the night before Trump was inaugurated. His book, it's called Uncompromising, but he believed in primary documents. And you're going to meet Ken Klippenstein, who works with primary documents, who gets leaks, which expose the mendacity of not only this administration, but those wielding power over the most vulnerable. He reported on the deportations of people off the streets in Portland. He's reported on the abuses of ICE. He's reported on white supremacy and its toxic reach in this administration. And he does so, as he will tell you, with documents. It's in the trenches journalism. You're going to meet Mark Hertsgaard, who just about a year and a half ago launched a project called Covering Climate Now, in the belief that journalism has yet to really lift up, amplify, cover adequately the existential crisis of our time, the climate crisis. And groups like Sunrise and other 350.org work with journalists to bring to bear the best journalism. This is a global project, and I hope you will learn more about it. It includes weathercasters in South Carolina and the Times of India, the largest paper in the world. 400 partners, journalistic partners. And we convened with the Columbia Journalism Review to launch a project, believing, by the way, and you might want to talk about this, that partnerships are part of our future. We partnered with the Texas Observer, covering climate now, and we have a beautiful partnership with Magnum Photographers about frontline workers, believing that different forms of journalism are critical in these times. We're going to launch a podcast called System Check with Dorian Warren and Melissa, and just believing that those voices and that media frame has real power. I'm sure you all listen to podcasts. I will close by saying that much of the nation's work is also covering the insurgent political movement we live in. We don't believe, as I think the corporate mainstream media does, that the differences really lie between Republicans and Democrats, and that constitutes the entire debate. We don't parachute into conflicts, to movements, and decide we want to find the leader and stress the conflict. We report deeply on the activists, the organizers, and other free thinkers. Now, we're tough too. We're not movement activists. We also have reported on the insurgents, AOC, the Squad, the new wave of progressives who are bringing bold progressive policies to their cities, counties, and states, and to, from DC to grassroots to ballot box. Above all, I believe that the work of independent journalism is not only to report things accurately. You have a right to your own opinion, not to your own facts, to describe things as they really are, but also to ask how they could be fundamentally changed. And so it's to fight against the view that there are no alternatives. This is a moment when people are organizing, fighting for a better country and a world, and have truly woken to the fragility of the freedoms of our democracy and our planet. And I think the journalism we do is vital in that, creating a different alternative. There is another world. And I'll close, I mean, think of the issues which we can, Liliana has covered criminal justice, fights, reform. Think of the issues which we have championed: Medicare for all, fight for 15 minimum, guaranteed job program, the Green New Deal, free higher ed. These are ideas which were once considered fringe ideas, but in terms of putting them on the forefront in the center of our country, I think, we've played a role amplifying, lifting. So I hope you'll feel a connection to the nation in print, in pixels, after this day, after hearing from our extraordinary journalists, remarkable, committed people. Tell your friends, allies, colleagues, partners, and introduce them to the nation. And I would simply say, there's a reason that journalists were called essential workers at the beginning of this crisis, of this pandemic. And if you do your work and you embrace questions, your curiosity, passion, you found, meaningful work. And I want to just end with a few words that sustain me in the dark hours. Someone who wrote for The Nation once wrote, "There are no lost causes, only causes waiting to be won." And that sustains me. So welcome. I think it's going to be a really interesting day. I hope to participate in some of it. And thank you for listening to me.
All right. Well, can you hear me? Someone nod their head if they can. I'll know we're live.
Yes.
Good. I'm Sasha Abramsky. I want to first thank the Nation for hosting this event. It's an incredibly important thing to bring younger journalism students together, whether in reality, in a setting, or virtually like this. As Katrina mentioned earlier, I was an intern at The Nation about 150 years ago in 1994. And it was one of the most formative experiences of my life. I'd just come out of college at Columbia Journalism School. I was looking to make a mark in the world of journalism. And I got an internship at this magazine that I'd sort of vaguely heard of called The Nation magazine. And it was absolutely transformative. It was in this old office in Greenwich Village. I think I got paid $75 a week, and I made up the difference working at Starbucks till 3 a.m. And I met the most wonderful people, just the most interesting, engaging editors, writers from all over the world, fellow interns. And by the end of that 4 months, after interning with Christopher Hitchens and the European editor, Daniel Singer, I realized that I wanted to spend the rest of my life as a journalist. And for me, The Nation has always had this extraordinary value. Its value as building a community of progressives, but also its value as a school for young, up-and-coming writers and thinkers. Because through the internship program, through its plans, through events like this, it helps school one generation after another generation after another generation of some of the best thinkers and analysts and strategists and writers in America. And I think it's a hugely valuable space because of that. And especially in a dangerous, unstable time, the kind of time that we're living through today, having a community of progressive thinkers like The Nation brings together is something that is just irreplaceable. It is literally priceless. With that said, I want to bring to you today a panel with 4 of the best writers and thinkers on the Nation platform. I don't know which order you can see them in on your screen, so I'm just going to go from top left on my screen and around. First, I'd like to introduce Elie Mystal, who is the Nation's justice correspondent. He's been covering the courts, the criminal justice system, and politics for many, many years. And he writes a column for The Nation called Objection. He is also a fellow at the Alfred Nobler Fellowship at the Type Media Center. To Elie Mystal's right on my screen is Liliana Segura. And she's a senior editor at The Intercept, where she has received the Texas Gavel Award, both in 2016 and in 2017. Liliana has also long been a writer and a contributor for The Nation magazine and has won numerous awards over the years for her reporting. Next to Liliana on my screen is Professor Sherri Williams from American University. Now, Professor Williams, before joining American University, was the co-director with Melissa Harris Perry of the Black on Campus program. And she has also helped with a new series at The Nation in 2020, Election Stories from the Next Generation. And last but not least on this panel is Zoe Carpenter, who is a longtime contributing writer to The Nation magazine, also a multiple award winner, the James Aronson Award, the Livingston Award, and many other awards for her writings on politics over the last many years. In the panel today, we're going to be discussing reporting in the age of the pandemic, the difficulties, the challenges, perhaps even the liberation of the new techniques involved in pandemic era reporting. The way we're going to do this is for about 35, 40 minutes, we're going to have a conversation on stage between the panelists. At about noon your time, give or take, I'm going to open it up for a conversation and we're going to start having Q&A from the audience. Now, this is a new technology that I'm using. I'm toggling between Zoom and Hopin. If there are any glitches on the Q&A, I'm not going to panic. Neither do you panic. We'll get the technical wizards at The Nation to help out if we need help. But I want to open by asking a question to all four of the panelists. And the opening question is, how do you change how you report, how you do your interviews, maybe even how you construct your stories, given the various new protocols and restrictions in place on pandemic reporting in an era when you've got to stand 6 feet away, you can't do inside journalism and all that stuff? We're going to start with Professor Williams, and then we're going to go to Liliana, to Zoe, to Elie.
Good morning, everyone. The one thing that I would say I think is really important, and especially thinking of the kind of project that I did with The Nation and students in my class and some fellows across the country, is to get started as soon as possible, because what we did were enterprise stories about young people's concerns about the election. But when we started this series, we had a completely different idea of what we thought this project would be, as opposed to what it ended up as. Because when we started this in January, we're thinking that instead of having Generation X or baby boomers reporters talk to young people about their election concerns, we'd use young reporters to do it. But after we started that, the pandemic erupted. Then a racial justice, the pandemic, then the recession, and a racial justice uprising happened. So all of these ideas that students were writing about, all of these election issues that they wrote about months ago during the school semester, changed very quickly. So the one thing that I would say is that, especially if you are working on enterprise or a little long-term kind of reporting in this era, it's really important that you start as early as possible and really remain malleable and changeable, because you just never know how things will happen and how your stories will change and take shape. And the one thing that I would say, I think it's really important that you start as early as possible with enterprise stories, is because in this pandemic era, a lot of people are dealing with a lot of different pressures that they wouldn't have imagined before. So talking to a reporter is probably the last thing that they're thinking about doing in the midst of dealing with the health fallout of this crisis, and both from the pandemic itself, and also the mental health fallout of it, the economic fallout. So, I mean, even the experts who are used to dealing with reporters on a regular basis just might not be too excited to speak with reporters, or it might not be a priority for them. So make sure you start to develop your stories as early as possible and reach out to your sources as early as possible. And also grant them some grace and really grant them some time, because people don't always have you're not going to always be a priority, and they might not always have the time to speak with you that they would have before pre-pandemic.
Thank you. And now let's move on to Liliana. You're reporting on a range of issues. You're also editing. How has editing stories and working with writers when everything's remote. How has your methodology shifted?
So first, a quick fact check, which is it's true that I was an editor at The Intercept when I started, and for some time after that. More recently, I'm actually now a senior reporter. I'm just doing my own reporting and writing, so just to clear that up. But to your question, about more than 5 years ago, I moved from New York City to Nashville, Tennessee, which was sort of unthinkable that I would ever do such a thing, but has proven to be really valuable in many ways, not the least of which is that it has given me sort of physical access and proximity to places in the country that I wouldn't have easily been able to get to. And that's had a huge benefit for my reporting. And that's certainly been true during the pandemic. Now, one thing that hasn't changed is for the better part of the past 5 years, I've been working at a home office. I mean, lo and behold, outside New York, you can actually have space in some places and be able to afford life. So I have a home office where I do my work. And that obviously didn't change. When the pandemic started, I continued to work from home. What did change dramatically was that I stopped traveling. I was previously doing a lot of flying to different places for events, but also for reporting. And so instead, I was home for probably the longest stretch of time I've ever spent at home in the same place as my husband. It was like, oh, wow, this is unique. So, I get a little stir crazy after a few days. So that was a challenge, but we were also very lucky. I'm a journalist with a job. My husband is also a journalist with a job. We have, we are able to continue to do our work. And so I've been very grateful for that. The other thing is, all of my stories that I had planned to do this year sort of just flew out the window. Like all my plans changed. But because my beat is criminal justice, because it's prisons, immediately it became very clear that this was going to be a story that was going to be impacting everyone and everything, involved in the criminal justice system. And before long, as so many of us did, I started hearing from sources and incarcerated people, families of incarcerated people, about COVID in prisons and how people were getting sick and how the criminal justice, both the state and the federal governments were failing to protect people. And that was an incredibly difficult period. It was really hard to know where to even sort of turn and respond and channel my energy. And one thing that I did find was an area that was really continues to be very undercovered in the midst of the pandemic, which is halfway houses. In my case, I was writing about federal halfway houses and how the pandemic had huge, not only implications, but spread halfway houses by their very nature are kind of this revolving door for both residents and staff and, threatened the communities around them in addition to the people who are living and working in those spaces. So I ended up writing about a number of articles about halfway houses. And that was an area of the system I'd never really written about before. And I guess more recently, despite the pandemic, the Trump administration decided that it was really important to execute a bunch of people in 2020. And so my most recent work for the past several months now has been traveling to Terre Haute, Indiana, which is home to the federal penitentiary where they carry out federal executions. To date, the Trump administration has carried out 7 federal executions since July, and they've got another one scheduled for November. And so because, again, I live in Nashville, it's not a very difficult drive to get up to Terre Haute. That's been my actual on-the-ground reporting that I've done during the pandemic. And I've had to take a lot of precautions in order to do that work comfortably and safely, but thus far have managed to, although I've done a lot less sort of man on the street reporting, a lot less door knocking, trying to kind of be safe where I am. So happy to talk about any or all of that down the line.
All right, thank you, Liliana. And now I want to move on to Zoe. Zoe, am I still live in Washington, D.C.?
No, I actually relocated back to Oregon, which is where I'm from, in March, which is a strange time to move. But after 13 years on the East Coast, I'm back west.
All right, so I was going to talk to you about ways to cover Washington, D.C. in the pandemic, but I think, on the assumption you probably still have some ideas on that, I'm going to, also ask you that. But more generally, Liliana had mentioned this whole issue of journalism and how, for us, the bread and butter of journalism, we go places, we interview people, and everything changes. So my question for you is, as somebody who likes getting in the mix and talking to people, how are you doing that when you can't travel at the moment?
Yeah, so a couple of things to share about that. I think it's been particularly frustrating for me, at least it was at the beginning of this year, because a lot of what I do is long form feature reporting that really depends on character and scene and the things that are more difficult to reconstruct if you're not there. On the other hand, there are lots of ways to do that work remotely. And so it's been a fun challenge to try to do that. So what kinds of documents can you get from your sources that might help you piece together a narrative, even if you can't see it in action? Or I've been doing lots of interviews over Zoom, actually, which has been really interesting. It's a little awkward at first, but phone calls are awkward too. So that's been a good way to get to know some of the characters I've been writing about. It also happens that there's been a lot of national news in Portland, where I'm living, and in Oregon, which is very unusual. The last time we had a year like that was when the Bundys were taking over the bird sanctuary. So I have actually done a little bit of on-the-ground reporting just because there's so much happening in Portland. So I've been out at the protests here and wrote about the wildfires. And then I guess the other thing that's been really useful to me, since I haven't been able to do as much man on the street type reporting, has actually been Facebook, which, Facebook is horrible. For a lot of reasons, it should die. But as a reporting tool, it can actually be incredibly useful if you're trying to reach people who are not public figures and whose email addresses are not on their websites. So especially when I was doing some reporting around the uprisings after George Floyd's murder, trying to contact people who were organizing and participating in demonstrations in small towns and rural areas. If I could find their names in local news sources, then I could find them on Facebook, send them a message, and see if they wanted to talk to me. So that's a really good way to reach people who don't have their contact information obviously available. And some people won't respond, and that's fine. But Twitter DMs, that works too sometimes, but there are still a lot of people who are not on Twitter who are definitely on Facebook. So, and then in terms of reconstructing things, I ask sources for photographs. I ask them for, can you send me screenshots of your text message with that person? Can you forward me that email exchange? So just finding other ways to get a sense for what was happening in a scenario. And then in terms of Washington, I don't know what it's like to cover Washington right now. I assume it's very strange that the sort of hanging out in the halls of Congress and chasing people around for quotes is not happening the way that it was 6 months ago. But unfortunately, I don't have a good feel for what's happening on the ground there right now.
All right, thank you. Now, Elie, you and I have talked a few times in the last few months, and I know you've been extremely sort of strict in staying at home and not going out and exposing yourself to the virus. And I know that as a freelance journalist, even in the best of times when there is no pandemic, it can be a little socially isolating because you have to self-motivate, you have to work out ways to generate work all the time, you have to work out boundaries when you're on duty, when you're off duty. And all of that gets magnified in a pandemic. And that's important for how you work, because to maintain the ability to work well and work fast, you've got to have a clear headspace. So my question for you is, how are you navigating the psychology of the pandemic as a freelancer?
Yeah, I mean, like, rum helps a lot. Like, I'm not gonna lie, there are some difficulties, right? Like, on the one hand, I think as Liliana was saying, I always work from home. I'm an opinion columnist. Like, on the kind of like in the first analysis, all the pandemic means is that I don't have to wear pants, which is not like a huge change in my life. So like that's great, right? But the heat
careful about your camera angle.
Right. The heat death of a columnist is when they become when they are subsumed into their own navel, right? It's when you stop taking in outside inputs, outside stimulus, when you get locked into your own network and you kind of like disappear up your own backside. That's when you get really bad columns. I'm sure we can all think of a few that we've read that seem to be talking about a world that exists like only in the columnist's head and not, is not generally applicable, right? And so without being able to go out, I mean, honestly, without being able to like go to a bar and sit and listen to what the bartender is saying, not my highfalutin friend that I'm having a drink with, but like, what's the waitress saying? What did the Uber driver say? Like, without being able to have, I mean, trust me, I don't write like I'm not Tom Friedman here. I'm not writing columns based on Uber, but I'm just saying, like, without that kind of input, it's very, I think, a dangerous time for columnists and analysts who aren't getting outside input into their writing. So what I've tried to do kind of very proactively is to expand my networks online. I'm on Signal now. Like, I was never on Signal before the pandemic, right? I'm on Signal now with different groups of different people, just talking about things. I'm more of a presence on Twitter, mainly because I want the feedback. It's almost like I crowdsource ideas on Twitter a little bit. Like, I'll tweet something and I'll get Ratio to be like, oh, that was stupid, and I'll move. That's not a good column. I'll move on. Zoe was talking about Facebook, and I totally agree. If Facebook could be burnt to the ground, that'd be good for America, but bad for my job. Like, it's helpful to kind of get in them. So like, I don't get to talk to. Take something very simple that's a real part of my pandemic experience, school, right? Like homeschooling. I've got 2 kids. You might see them at some point kind of running through my shot. And I have thoughts about homeschooling, right? But I'm also like, I live in Westchester and I have like, my wife is a lawyer and we're private school. And so like our homeschooling experience is like really different than the homeschooling experience of lots and lots of other people. And Facebook is a great way for me to kind of stay connected, to stay in contact with experiences of parents who are not me, who don't have my privileges and advantages, and how they're dealing with, and that can all go into then the column about homeschooling. So it's a lot of like, what I would say to young people is like, don't think that it happens by accident, right? You got to do things with intentionality, right? Like, I put myself into conversations, into groups, into Zoom calls and meetings with intentionality to try to expand the amount of inputs I'm getting into my own brain, so I don't just like bounce off these 4 walls, and start basically sounding like David Brooks, right? Like that's what I'm trying to avoid.
Well, Elie, thank you for that. And I want to follow up with a more general question to all 4 of you, which is that it's tempting to sort of let the pandemic overwhelm everything. And yet, of course, in reality, the world continues. There's still an election, there's still a Supreme Court battle, there's still fires out west, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in many ways, a lot of the crises are now overlapping. The political, the environmental, the public health, the judicial, they're all overlapping and sort of amplifying and exaggerating each other. And the next question I have for you, and it may be the last question before I shift it over, since there's already a lot of questions coming in, but the next question I have for you is, what are you currently working on story-wise? And then sort of using your crystal ball, what do you see yourself working on over the next few months? There's obviously the election, but what do you think are the sort of huge issues that you will be and have to be covering over the next few months? We're going to start this time. I cut out?
Yeah, Sasha, we don't know who you're starting with.
I'm starting with Zoe.
Okay. So I just finished a big feature on domestic violence, and one of the things that those of you, some of you may already know, but the rest of you might discover, is that there's this sort of boom and bust cycle, especially if you do a lot of feature reporting where you work really hard on one project for a long time and it occupies so much of your brain space, and it's really exciting and great. And then there's a period when you're looking for story ideas and it's really terrifying and feels horrible. It's like, oh, I'll never write again. Why? Like, I have no ideas. So I'm in that space right now where I'm thinking about what I'm going to be working on for the next couple of months. I'm really interested in what happens to all of this conspiracy energy that's going on. I think regardless of who wins the election, that's not going away. And I think we've reached a really dangerous, obviously, a dangerous era of post-truth politics, and now we're seeing that play out on the ground in really interesting ways. So that's something that I'm interested in writing about. Obviously, that's a very loose, broad framework. I also do a lot of reporting around intersections of public health and inequality. I'm sure I will be doing more reporting about that. And then I think I'm always interested in stories about the aftermath of crises that get reported often in kind of a flash in the pan way. And I think the wildfires on the West Coast are going to be a really good example of that. So I've been in touch with a family that I wrote about who lost their home in the fires. And I mean, for them, it's probably going to be years if they ever can recover from what they lost from the fire. So just thinking about ways to, you know, what's the second month story on a crisis that was covered really intensely in the national media for just a week, or what's the 6-month story, or what's even the 2-year story. And for that kind of work, I think staying in touch with sources over a long period of time is really important. And often it's not clear where that's going to lead, but having some faith that staying in touch with people might eventually yield some really important insights is, to me at least, useful.
Right, thank you. And Professor Williams, I know that you're now teaching, but are you also doing some writing? And if so, what are you working on? And if you're not, what are your students working on? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, I am sometimes still writing for the popular press, but mostly a lot of my writing is academic now. But I'll tell you something that I'm interested in writing about as an academic and also as a journalist, and something that I think that all of us should be looking at is how during this pandemic and also this racial justice uprising and also this economic recession, we have seen systems change at lightning speed in ways that they should have changed in the first place, right? So one example that I can think of is how the federal government has now put forbearances and capped the interest on student loan debt. And this has been incredibly helpful for all of the millions of people across the country who are really kind of like economically stifled by this, right? So if you typically had to pay $700 a month for a student loan debt payment, and you don't have to pay that, you haven't had to pay that since March, then how does your life change, right? And how, like, what does that mean to be able to just breathe a little bit economically, right? Even though there are all these other problems. But my question and my story, I think, is why didn't the government make this kind of change a lot earlier? Like, why did it have to take a pandemic for us to have these sorts of changes? So I'm really interested in interrogating ways that systems have changed very quickly when they could have all along. And as a person who is a former journalist and now a journalism professor, I even think of journalism and how a lot of media outlets, from Bon Appetit to the editorial department of the New York Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, all of these changes, and the Washington Post now has a managing editor of diversity and inclusion. A lot of these changes that mainstream media has made very quickly in the last 3 months are changes that the Kerner Commission called for more than 50 years ago. So why did it have to take these huge national emergencies for us to make these changes? So really interrogating systems and how systems move quickly in times of crisis, and what that means that it actually takes these huge national emergencies for us to make these changes that should have been made long ago. Those are the stories that I'm interested in interrogating in different arenas in the future.
Thank you very much. And Elie, I'm going to go for you next. I imagine you're probably doing an awful lot of work on the Supreme Court, but what are you working on, and what will you be working on?
Just at the moment, right? Yeah, look, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, it was a Friday. I found out about 7:30. I wrote my post, and then I cried. And I cried not just for the country, because that's terrible, and not just for all of the rights that are now under threat, although that's also terrible, but I also cried for myself, because like I knew like that's just gonna be my life now for a bit. So yeah, no, I'm all in on the Supreme Court. I'm doing what I can with a keyboard to try to push the narrative in terms of what the liberal response needs to be to this assault on our rights. I think that for the most part, the left has done a very bad job in explaining to its own voters, its own base, why courts are important, what courts do, how they can be manipulated, how the Republicans are manipulating them. So those are things that all come to a head when you have a confirmation battle. which is going to be my next week. But then even kind of going forward, assuming, hoping that, there's a new administration involved, like, put it like this, when I about 2 or 3 years ago, some idiot Republican on Twitter said to me, "Oh, without Trump, you'd have no job." And I'm like, man, you have no idea how excited I was to keep my foot up HRC's backside for 4 years. Like, I was ready to be the loyal opposition to Hillary Clinton. I feel like that was robbed from me. So certainly if we have a new administration come January 20th, like, I will feel like my job will be to hold that administration accountable to the kinds of ideas and the kinds of policies, and certainly when it comes to the Supreme Court, the kind of jurists and justices and judges that we need to demand now. And I am really hoping that I have the opportunity to be pissed off at liberals, because it's a lot more fun than just screaming at the endless screaming at Republicans. Like, that's boring. So I'm hoping to be working on that going forward.
Well, I hope you get your wish. Liliana, before we move over to the questions from the audience, do you want to tackle this one?
I'll be brief. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, as I mentioned before, the Trump administration and Bill Barr especially seem to be pretty intent on carrying out as many federal executions as they can, regardless of what's going to happen in the election. And so I'm bracing myself, as are basically everyone paying attention to the federal death penalty, for new execution dates. We could get more today. And so it looks like I'll be continuing to write about that. At this very moment, I've been struggling actually with a story, a follow-up to a story about the last man who was executed, whose name is Christopher Villalba, and he was only 19 years old when he committed a horrible crime in Texas, was sent to death row along with his co-defendant, who was 18 at the time. Both are young Black men. Christopher Villalba was executed 2 weeks ago 2 weeks ago yesterday, and I got to know his mom a little bit. I got to know him a little bit. So actually I've been talking to his mom since his execution, and I'm writing a story about what it's been like for her, essentially, to bury her son, and writing about what it was like for her to finally be able to touch his body after more than 20 years where she wasn't able to. She also witnessed the execution. So it's a difficult story, but it's a very human story, and it's a side of this system that people don't see. So that's what I'm working on today as soon as this event is over. And striving to kind of tell those kinds of stories the more this execution machinery continues.
All right, that is extremely disturbing, and I do look forward to reading your story. I'm going to open it up to the audience questions, because we are getting a ton of questions in the chat from students. I'm going to amalgamate 2 questions for the opener. So this one's from Lehi Yona. And Lehi says that I've been having a hard time lately pitching stories that aren't directly related to the pandemic or to Trump. Do you have any advice on how to navigate the current media landscape? And then I'm going to add into that a question from Jared Facundo. What new reporting protocols brought by the onset of the coronavirus do you see lasting beyond the pandemic? These are all addressed to everybody, I believe. I guess a question to the audience, if you want to address them specifically to one panel member, could you please mention that in the question? But I'm going to assume otherwise they're open. So which of you wants to tackle that?
I can take pitching. And I'll take it from the perspective of being fundamentally a law reporter and a court reporter. For most of my career, I've had difficulty pitching stories about the thing that I think is important, the court, to publications who either don't get it or don't care or think it's too, nerdy, or inside baseball, right? And so one of the things that I have learned is to make every one of my, Supreme Court pitches tied to some other current event, something that's going to pop, something that's going to make editors and publications feel like it's relevant today, right now, right? I'm almost never in a situation where I'm pitching a story that, put like this, I feel like it's my job when I'm pitching to convince the editor why what I am doing actually has relevance today to what's going on, right? So I would kind of say, like, if you have a story that is not related to the pandemic, no, everything's related to the pandemic somehow, right? Like find, and like it's on you to like telescope in and find that pandemic angle. The Trump thing is a little bit more difficult because on the one hand, we don't want to act like our entire society is based on this one idiot man. Like we don't want to fall into that trap. On the other hand, Trump makes the clicks happen. Like that's just a thing, right? And so you have to kind of balance that. But you can, I think in this moment, it's not that difficult to tell an editor, look, this is the thing that's happening. While everybody's distracted by roid rage president, this is the thing that's happening that's really important. Like I think you can make that argument, but you have to have it. But it is on you to have it related to some kind of current event or current event in the way that that publication thinks it's a current event, right? So like if you're pitching to Scientific America, you better have something that's relevant today in science, right? It goes through every publication. So try to work your pitch into the current event, and just realize that's always part of the game that you're going to be playing.
Thank you, Elie. Got three other panelists. Any of you want to jump in?
I'll jump in just on the second question about reporting protocols. This isn't really a protocol, but I think there's been a more creative effort, especially by national journalists like myself, to look for local angles on national stories, since traveling more widely is not as possible right now. And I think that's something that I hope continues. Obviously, there are pitfalls with that. Every time you have someone who has sort of a national framework doing local stuff, there are risks of parachute style things. But I do think, especially since local journalism has been so decimated, and that's a problem that should be fixed on its own. And I don't think that we can fill that gap totally, but I do hope that an effort to find the ways in which these kind of big national trends and structures impact local places, that continues, because I think it's great to have reporting that's not just all based around DC and New York.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm going to move on to the next question, and this is addressed to everybody, but I'd like Professor Williams to give the first answer. And then actually, Liliana Segura, I'd like you to give the second answer based on the depth of reporting that you're doing around capital punishment and so on. And the question is from Miranda Dotson. Journalism has changed quite a bit since 1994. It seems like with Facebook and Twitter feeds, we're inundated with articles. How do you do your work in the age of skimming and headline reading?
For me, it's about leaning more toward the media outlets that I trust and the media outlets that I know are doing some real fact checking that also provide really important context and also center the voices and experience of people. So I purposely don't read a lot of one source stories, because there's no way that one person can be the authoritative voice on everything that affects regarding a particular issue. So really what I've been trying to do is really be deliberate, because we are inundated with so much information. I'm really trying to be really deliberate about what I read. And that's not to say that I'm trying to create an information bubble, but I'm also really just trying to focus on who I trust, and who I trust is actually doing some real reporting and not just a lot of aggregation. Because it's really funny, because you can find, like, a lot of people aren't doing original reporting anymore. If you have one reporter who does a story and they get something fundamentally wrong, because everyone wants to be next and they don't want to not have the same information on their site, then they're going to basically just aggregate, rephrase, and link to what that other person reported. And then, but that one original major fundamental fact error is going to be repeated and amplified over and over and over, because that person didn't do their actual regular, just fundamental reporting in the first place. So now everybody gets it wrong. So that's why I think it's really, really important for you to really make sure that you are subscribing to and reading publications, news media outlets that you know are really doing some authentic reporting, because like the rate at which misinformation is being amplified is just really astounding these days. So just make sure, and it should be a variety, right? It should, I'm not saying just legacy media. It should be all types of media, including ethnic media, the Black press, for example, and LGBTQ media.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that last one in particular. I always tell my students, I also teach journalism, and I always tell them, read as broadly as possible. And if you speak multiple languages, read in as many languages as possible, because you get a different take and you get a different sense of what's happening if you're reading press from one country or another. And that breadth of opinion is important. But Liliana, you're reporting on capital punishment and all kinds of really complicated moral issues. And you want your readers to read the full 5,000 or 6,000 words. But as the question says, a lot of them are going to read the headline and then skim the rest. How do you navigate that sort of short attention span?
I don't know. I don't know how to, I guess my own attention span has been decimated by social media and even worsened by the pandemic. I hope I'm not alone. I don't think I am. I have had the hardest time focusing, which is why this particular story, as difficult as it is occasionally emotionally, because it's a sad story, I think it's just been that much harder because I feel constantly overwhelmed and anxious by everything. And so trying to manage my time on Twitter, not doing a great job. I can't let go of Facebook for the reasons that Zoe laid out. I rely on it to get in touch with and just shamelessly stalk sources and potential sources all the time. And so, you know, I basically have to do what I've done for years now, which is not pay too much attention to the traffic, to the numbers, not psych myself out by saying no one's going to read this whole thing, because I do tend to do, as Zoe mentioned, you know, long form investigative stuff. And just, I guess what I come back to again and again is that, you know, I know that in general, especially right now, I'm telling a story that nobody else is telling, or I'm telling a story in a way that's different from what I can expect to read somewhere else. And I have to believe that a reader, if you can get them interested past the headline, you know, and draw them into a compelling human narrative, that they will stick with you, at least for part of that. And I have found that to be true at times when I've been writing really long sort of investigative deep dives into, for example, wrongful conviction cases. I've written a fair number of those. And, you know, sometimes it also means, I mean, yeah, the challenge is for me remaining motivated and telling myself that this story matters, even if, you know, it's not going to have the wide readership that like my latest tweet might have on occasion, you know, but it also matters. It matters for the people who are trusting me with their stories. It matters for their families. It matters for those who do read it. And what keeps me sort of motivated and going in those moments is, you know, getting feedback from readers, getting emails from people who, you know, remember a case and who, you know, came across my article in you know, somewhere else in the country, that someone I wouldn't have necessarily expected to reach. So, you know, I think the attention span problem is real. I know I have it. I find it really hard to get through any number of types of articles, but I kind of just have to push through and commit to continuing to do the work that I'm doing. But it's not always easy.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move on just because there are so many questions coming in the room right now, and we've only got about for the Q&A. We have a really good question here from Leon McMahon. How do you approach reporting on crises, whether that is the wildfires out west, the COVID-19 pandemic, or racism and white supremacy and the uprisings against them, that directly affect you, either directly or indirectly, he says. And I want to add on a little bit to that question. So, you know, almost by definition, if you write for a magazine like The Nation, it means you care about issues. You're not just doing it for the money, because you'd be doing it somewhere else if it was just about the money. So you're doing it because you care about the issues. And these issues oftentimes are quite emotional and quite devastating, frankly. How do you navigate that? You're a professional journalist, but you're also a human being. And when your emotions get riled up by a story, it can be difficult. So how do you navigate that sort of boundary there between the professional life and the emotional life? And again, this is to all of you. I don't mind who goes first, but I want all four of you to answer.
I'll start since I'm the most emotional writer, I think, here. Editors. is how I navigate it. I cannot emphasize how important good editing is, right? Because especially, I think for me, it was after George Floyd was murdered. I mean, the emotions were high. This is, I'm a African-American man. I've got 2 Black sons, and watching that man killed over 8 minutes and 46 seconds hurt. And I write about law and I write about criminal justice, so I understand what's happening from a professional academic level, but also I understand what's happening from an emotional. I mean, I witnessed terrorism, and then had to write about it. And sometimes you put a lot of blood into your work, and that's when you rely on your editors, who hopefully are good, who hopefully you have a relationship with, to catch you, to shape you, to take to tell you when to put the brakes on and tell you when to go full hog. I mean, my main editor at The Nation, I mean, I love her. Like I rely on her so much, and there are pieces that I can write that I don't, that she helps, but I don't need her for. But there are pieces that in this point in my life that I won't even attempt to write unless I know that she's got my back, right? Because I need the net. So how to put that in a more general sense, like, you don't have to do this stuff alone. Right. And I think a lot of people writing, especially when they're first starting out, writing such a solitary kind of, sitting with you and your computer and your keyboard, and it's just you. And doesn't have to be that way. Right. Like, even if you don't have a great editor, you've got friends, you've got contacts, you've got other people who can give you a second set of eyes, who can give you a second look at your thing. And that can be, I think, in times of high stress, high emotion, high impact writing and stories, that can be invaluable. So,
thank you, Elie. Zoe, why don't you go next on this one?
Yeah, so I tend to not instinctively put myself in stories, not because I think it's bad to do that. It's just my personal style. But I do think that acknowledging personal experience when it's relevant is important, not because it's bad to have that experience, because it can add texture. Just often I just generally feel my personal experience is not particularly relevant. Like when I was writing about the wildfires, I wasn't really affected by them here. I mean, I was affected in the sense that the smoke was bad and it was uncomfortable, but I didn't lose my house. And for me, it was much more interesting to report on someone else's experience who had been much more affected than to write about how I experienced the smoke. So that was my instinct in a story like that. But then I think also paying attention to moments where you as a reporter do have a strong emotional response to something, or a conflicting one, and interrogating that can actually lead to the piece becoming much more interesting and stronger. So an example of that is when I was doing a story on children whose parents had been affected by addiction in West Virginia, and how that was then affecting the school system. I realized that I was watching certain children and observing them in different ways because I knew certain things about their parents. And so noticing that I was bringing a different lens to those particular children. And I kind of worked that into the story because I thought it was really important to acknowledge that the sort of pre-existing knowledge that we have about our sources can cloud the way that we then write about them. So I think in certain situations like that, it is really important it can be important to bring yourself into the story and your personal experience. And of course, as Elie said, having a great editor to walk through that territory is so helpful.
Thank you. Liliana, how about you go next?
I don't know. I guess, well, I think I do a fair amount of compartmentalizing in general, and especially now when it comes to sort of something that's impacting me emotionally, and sort of the thing that I'm trying to write. And it's not that I'm immune to sort of a human emotional response, in the subject matter I'm writing, but I can maintain a certain distance because I didn't grow up directly impacted, by the carceral system. I didn't have a family member on death row. And so, I'm always coming at when it comes to that material, I'm coming from a position sort of as an outsider. On the other hand, part of what brought me into journalism and part of what drew me to the Nation in the first place as an intern was the knowledge that this was a place where I didn't have to pretend to have some sort of objective lens from which to assess an issue like the death penalty. I was very much against the death penalty when I arrived at the Nation, and I kind of had a home in activist communities. And I still have those activist networks and those activist contacts, and they include and are often led by people who are directly impacted, whose loved ones have been sent to death row and who have spent years advocating for them. And that has really strengthened my own network of sources. It's given me sort of a connection to people who oftentimes are the first ones to know what's going to happen. And I think I don't shy away from that. That's central to how I developed my work and the kind of what keeps me going, frankly. And I will say that, reporting in Terre Haute, it's been a very bizarre experience in a number of ways. But one thing that has been very strengthening, I think, has been sort of to see from a distance, to be surrounded by some familiar faces who are abolitionists, who do anti-death penalty work, who are treating this as a human issue and not just something that's happening over there far away to other people.
Thank you. And Sherri, let's do your answer on this, and then I'm going to move to a related set of questions that have just come in. So I'm going to circle back to the emotion side in a minute as well.
Okay. Well, really quickly, I will say that I think that it can really be informative to your stories and your readers if you do tap into your own lived experience. And I'm not saying that you have to necessarily write first-person reported pieces, but if you are writing a story about maybe some entitlement program, and I really hate that term too, but if you're writing about any kind of like social welfare programs or anything like that, and if you have ever received government assistance, then not to say that you have to include your experience in there, but that can better inform the kinds of questions that you ask about the bureaucracy that happens, about some of the stigma and prejudice that people encounter when they're trying to get benefits, and both when they're actually using benefits. When I was a reporter in Jackson, Mississippi, and I was covering social services, when it was time, when I was just assigned that beat on top of another full-time beat that I was covering with no raise, I was able to really tap into my own experiences of growing up, having received food stamps and welfare cash benefits and living on HUD vouchers, and in the 1980s getting block cheese from the government. So, I mean, again, I didn't write about my own personal experience, but when I interviewed people, both some of the regular people who were receiving some of the state benefits, and also when I talked to, most importantly, some of those politicians and bureaucrats who ran some of those programs, I was able to use some of my own personal experience and lived experience to actually ask better questions, to better inform the stories. So again, it's not that you have to just use your personal experience all the time, but like there are some things that people have written about, but they haven't experienced. You have experienced certain things in life, so therefore you are an expert on them, and you can use that lived experience and that expertise to ask better questions and to create a better narrative.
Thank you. And that's going to segue very nicely to the next question. So the whole issue of lived experience and the fact that you're a journalist, but you're also a human being, you're also a member of the community, and you build relationships within the reporting. And I'm actually going to address these two questions primarily to Zoe and Liliana. So the first is from Serena Paul, and the question is, how do you stay in touch with sources when they're not a part of the story that you're working on? And then from Zoa Ahmed, the question is, when you're interviewing and talking to your sources online, is it hard to set proper boundaries between work and your personal life? And Liliana, why don't you go first on that?
Yes, it is hard to set those boundaries, especially during the pandemic, because, and I find myself sometimes guilty of this myself with, I'm just like, well, I'm home, I'm online. Why isn't everybody, that's just not true for everyone. And so, but also, depending on the source, depending on the person, my tendency is to want to respond and not leave people hanging, especially if they're in a kind of vulnerable position. But and I do think that's gotten worse during the pandemic. But I do think it's important to establish those boundaries. I have had some people who have sort of emailed and texted at all hours of the day, and I've sort of just not responded, and eventually they do get the message. I'm not sure that I'm great at it. But to the first part, staying in touch, I guess it depends on the story. A number of my sources, once they're sources or once I've told a story that, say it's about somebody's case, I write a lot about individual cases. Even when I'm not writing about them, chances are I'm going to write about them again. And so we stay in touch. If it's somebody in prison, I'm writing letters, I'm writing emails, and those maintaining those contacts can be important. I found out that a man that I've written a lot about over the years, who's almost certainly innocent, serving a life sentence in Tennessee, got COVID. Like so many people got COVID. And I wouldn't have known that had I just sort of written a one and done story about his case. And that sort of applies in many other cases. But otherwise, I don't always stay in touch with sources who, once I've finished the story, I was relying on them for. I guess it's sort of a little bit case by case, but I do think it's valuable to do, and I do try to do it when I can.
Zoe.
Yeah, I guess most of what I have to say would just echo Liliana. I also have some trouble setting those boundaries sometimes. Not trouble necessarily setting them, but just there's a need to be flexible in when and how I work. A woman that I really needed to talk to recently could only talk to me on a Saturday afternoon. That was fine. There's not that much going on right now for me otherwise. So I think it gets tricky if a source starts to contact you in a way that suggests they're looking for friendship, or that they've forgotten that everything they tell you might be published. And so I try to be really conscientious about reminding sources multiple times, especially if I'm talking to them over a period of time, like, hey, every time you reach out to me, that's on the record, or if we have a different arrangement, then we talk about that. But I think, especially if you're reporting on people who aren't used to dealing with the media, being really upfront about what communications are on record and what aren't, and what that even means, is super important to creating those boundaries. And then, what was the other question? I'm sorry, I'm blanking.
Well, the question essentially is, how do you navigate whether or not the source becomes your friend?
And then the question about staying in touch with them, right? Okay, so they can't become your friend, and that's just an absolute line. They're not your friend. You're not their friend. In terms of staying in touch with them, like Liliana said, case by case basis, and I just try to be really upfront about what the process looks like for me. If I'm working on a long story over time, or I'm working on a follow-up, I'll just tell them that, like, hey, I'm not exactly sure when I'm going to be writing a follow-up story, but I'd love to stay in touch with you, just because I'm curious about how your life is going to look in a year, or I just love to hear about how the rebuilding process goes for you, for example, if it's after a natural disaster. And so just being really clear about what your objective is, so that they don't feel like in the end that you wanted something that they weren't interested in providing to you, or that they don't understand what the terms of the communications are.
And building on this, and maybe Zoe, you could answer it quickly, and then if a couple others want to jump in too, that would be fine. But building on this, when you're talking with sources, even if you're clear and it's on record versus off record, and they know exactly what they're saying, there is still the risk that you're taking somebody into an emotional space that maybe don't want to go, and that you can re-traumatize them if, for example, you're dealing with a very traumatic personal event. And especially if they're a private citizen and they're not used to being in the spotlight, that can be, quite a difficult challenge. How do you do an honest interview while being aware of the risk of re-traumatizing someone?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think there are going to be definitely big differences depending on the situation. But I actually encountered that in this story that I just published with a woman who wanted to be on the record. She wanted to use her full name, and she really wanted to tell me about a very traumatic series of experiences. And so what I did was I checked in with her throughout the interview, and didn't just do it at the beginning and then the end, but saying things like, are you comfortable continuing to talk about this? Or I have another question about that. Is it okay if, we go into that in more detail? Are you feeling okay right now? Those sort of check-in things. And when she would say something that seemed particularly revealing, either emotionally or factually, in this case, because it was such a delicate situation, I did check in about certain details about whether she was comfortable with that appearing in print. And sometimes, especially if you're doing adversarial interviews with, public figures, they don't warrant that same kind of care, right? But for someone who has never spoken to a journalist before, especially if they're young or, just for whatever reason, talking about a really traumatic experience, I do really think about what the impact of those details appearing in print might be on their life, and try to really talk about that with them.
Well, thank you. And I owe the question, I forgot to mention your name. That question came from Ellen Lee. Do any of the other three want to add to that, or shall I move on to another question? All right, I'm going to move on.
I'll just say that those answers are great reasons why I have no desire to be a reporter, right? Like those are really tough spaces to navigate. It's not for everybody, right? Like I don't like to name the lobsters, right? Like, I go in the restaurant, I don't want to know that, Lobster Jimmy, a friend. No, I just want it just put it on my plate so I can eat it. And like what Liliana and Zoe have to do is just, that is emotional labor that is not for everybody.
Well, Elie, since you have so clearly staked your claim to not being a reporter, let me move on to a question which is aimed for you, which is from Andrew Lawrenson. How does an opinion writer first start out in the industry, and what type of first jobs out of college should aspiring opinion writers look for?
I love this question. Thank you so much. So, first thing to do is to be an expert. And that sounds like, I don't mean that flippantly, right? Like, you have to be a good opinion writer. You have to establish a platform for why anybody should listen to your opinion, right? And to do that, you have to have some expertise, right? So like my first job out of college was going to law school. And my first job out of law school was working at a law firm, because I couldn't like take, 1L, legal training and then spin that off necessarily into being a legal opinion writer, because I didn't have opinions that anybody should have listened to, right? It is important to, I think, couch your opinion in some kind of expertise. That expertise can be training, it can be research, it can be lived experiences. But it's got to be something. You have to have some kind of platform to get people to explain to your reader why your opinions are relevant or important or should be taken seriously at all. Right? That's really the first step. The second step, I would just say, is it's helpful to be able to know yourself. As an opinion writer, you are trying to show, my fundamental job, right, is to show people how the world looks from my eyes. And I can't do that if I'm not like super comfortable in my own skin, if I'm not super aware of how I look at things, right? Like I have to know myself. I have to know my biases, my limitations, my blind spots. Because if I'm trying to explain to you how I see it, I have to be really clear in my own head about how I'm looking at things, right? So be an expert in something and know yourself. And those are two legs of the stool in terms of getting into opinion writing. The third leg is like be interesting, but like it's harder to learn. You just kind of are, you aren't. But if you can ground your opinions and expertise and ground them in a real sense of who you are and what you're trying to show people, that's a great start.
All right, thank you. And I want to move to a question which I think is aimed at Sherri Williams. And this is from Jimin Kang. And the question is, when I first started studying journalism at school, I was encouraged to be as objective and removed as possible from the piece that I was writing. That view has, however, been increasingly challenged, particularly this year, given how COVID-19 has impacted people in different ways, of course, the BLM movement. And it makes me wonder if the tenet of, quote, hard objectivity, fundamental to the journalistic tradition, is changing in some way, going to change, or should change.
Well, I feel like even though the goal is objectivity, I feel like mainstream media has always been operating under the guise of the myth of objectivity. And I say that particularly as a Black woman in America, born into a poor and working class family with roots in the Deep South. So if we put all of those groups together, poor people, Southerners, working class people, women of color, Black women, none of those groups have been covered objectively by the media. So it's particularly journalism, these groups have either been totally invisibilized, ignored, or there's been a lot of a mass media term called symbolic annihilation. When groups who don't have a lot of social power are covered in media, they are often stereotyped and trivialized. So when we think about objectivity, depending on the group that you're talking about, there are several groups in this country who would argue that they've never been covered objectively and that they've never really been covered at all. So that's one thing, and especially when we think about like working class and poor people of any race, right? If we really take a look at how poor and working class people are covered, they are either not covered at all or just in these really ugly and stereotypical ways. So the best thing that I can say that young journalists and all journalists should try to do is really just try to stick to adding keeping the facts central and elevating and amplifying the voices of people who are affected by these facts the most, and also really do a good job of trying to add as much context into these stories as possible. So we know that there is this issue of COVID or the racial justice uprising, the economic recession, whatever it is. But so there are facts like statistics and figures that you can add into those stories and find people who are really affected by them and add in some really important context. I just think that's really central and important to what you can and what you should be doing. But I really just think that as an industry, we really need to be thinking about objectivity, because for some of us in this country, we've never had objectivity when we've been covered.
Can I just crap on objectivity for a second? Because even though I do opinion writing, and so obviously I'm not like bound by that old school way of thinking. Like it's just not something that's ever been true, right? I write about the law. People think the law is objective. The Constitution was written by slavers and colonists. Now that is an objective fact. Whether you think that fact is important is subjective. Right. So whether I decide to remind you that the Constitution was written by slavers and colonists is my subjective input into the story that I'm writing. But the objective fact remains, right? So there are so many articles, situations, stories, whatever, that are fundamentally subjective. You're subjective in your story selection. You're subjective in what facts you choose to emphasize and what facts you choose to drop out. You're subjective in what sources you talk to and who you talk to. The whole game is subjective. It is like art, right? It is, the Mona Lisa is not an objective picture, a portrait of a woman. It is a subjective impression from a master artist, right? And so the issue of whether or not there is some outside objective standard is just not true. What there are facts, and choosing which facts to bring to your readers is your subjective choice as the writer, as the reporter, or as the commentator.
I appreciate that very much, and I'm going to build on what you've just said to ask a question from Francesca Story. And if I'm mispronouncing your name, I apologize. But this is going to be for Zoe and Liliana. And the question is sort of a building on this idea of objectivity, but also on the idea of emotional responsibility, I think. And the question is how to avoid parachute reporting when covering a social movement, especially movements outside the United States? And this is obviously about power dynamics and all kinds of things. And I wonder if Liliana and then Zoe, if you can tackle that one.
Well, yeah, I'm very conscious of the parachute reporting problem in general. And I especially was when I was traveling from, say, New York to Memphis, Tennessee, a place I hadn't really lived in or worked in, or where I, had deep personal roots. And I think it's very important to sort of be conscious of that issue as you're going into a story, regardless of who you're covering or what movement you might be covering. I guess what I have done when I have found myself in those situations is read everything I can, get a basic grasp of sort of not only the what's going on currently in that place, but also some of the history of that place. And that was especially important when I was traveling in and out of Memphis. In that case, it was covering a death penalty case and then eventually a death penalty retrial. And I found that the more I learned about the history, the current controversies in that place, the history of that place, the proximity of the Confederate monuments to the courthouse where I was going in every day during the trial, and how completely, utterly blatant it all was, it was impossible to ignore some of this context, which I had only sort of somewhat understood going in. And so I guess I would say, if you have the luxury of time, or even if you don't, just make an effort to learn, a little bit or a lot, as much as possible, about the place you're going. And I guess the same would apply to these to movements. I don't cover movements and I don't cover international movements. But like I said before, the anti-death penalty movement, such as it is right now, is one that I have covered in the past. And I do, and I have seen it evolved and I've seen it shaped, and I've tried to maintain a sort of critical distance from it. But I guess I try to just check my own assumptions and biases when approaching that work. But really, what I said before applies to, I think, any subject matter, is kind of learning the history of the people, the places where you're covering, and not assume that or check yourself on your own stereotypes and assumptions.
Thank you. And Zoe, do you want to add to that?
I agree. Reading everything that you can, research, building as many relationships as you can. I think expecting that it might take longer if you don't know a place, if you can spend more time there. And then paying attention to local news too, and doing it in a way that is respectful of the work they've done, and citing them if they've been helpful to you. Knowing what the local media landscape looks like, I think, is really important. I don't have a ton of experience in the international context. I did do a story in Ecuador last year, and one thing that was really important to me for that story, and it was a bit of a luxury, is that I had a really excellent fixer who was connected to the movement I was writing about. I was writing about abortion prosecutions. And so not only was she my translator, but she also knew a lot of the people that I needed to be in touch with, and she understood some of the inner dynamics of the movement there and its history, or could connect me to people who knew that. And she was completely invaluable to that story. And obviously that's a luxury that not everybody has for reporting, but especially for an international story that is going to be of any substantive length. I think really choosing the people who are helping you in that capacity wisely is very important.
Thank you. Well, we got about 10 minutes left on this panel, and we've got a ton more questions. But I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out one last question, which seems to me a good summary. And I'd like each of you to respond in quite a bit of depth to it, and then we'll put that to bed and we'll move on to the next one. But the last question is from Elliot Lewis. And the question for all four of you is this: how do you keep up morale as progressive journalists? And is it difficult to see a lack of social change in response to the articles that you write? Now, you don't have to accept Elliot's premise, but there's the question. We're going to start, I think, we'll start with Sherri, then we'll move to Elie, we'll go to Zoe, and then...
Okay. Well, before I answer the question about morale, I just want to talk about a little bit about the myth of objectivity for a second, just to go back a little bit, because one thing that I think it's important for us to always kind of keep in mind is, when is objectivity called into question? It is typically when it is about stories that are not about people who hold a lot of power in society and people who have the power to not only tell, but also widely distribute their stories. So I just want to keep that in mind. Whenever people are saying that you need to be more objective or you're not being objective, it's 9 times out of 10 because you're writing about people who their experiences or the issues that they experience challenge the status quo. We really don't hear a lot of, well, I guess we do in a sense, in this polarized political atmosphere, but I would argue that politics are not covered objectively because they're covered in a binary. We really only hear from Democrats and Republicans. We don't hear from the Green Party. We don't hear a lot about independents or libertarians or communists or socialists, or if we do, it's in a way that's extremely stigmatized. So just to the person who asked that question and to other student and emerging young journalists, when that argument of objectivity comes up, start to really think about why that question was asked and the frame in which it was asked. So now on over to being excited about writing about all of this oppression. It can be very discouraging, but the thing that I think of the most right now that I think is really important is all of these voices that really deserve to be covered. And now for at least this slight moment in time, and hopefully this window will stay open forever, but history tells me that it probably won't. But now that a lot of mainstream editors are interested in hearing from Black people in particular, and people of color across the board, and working class people, because of the recession related to COVID, then now is really the time for us to really kind of let some of that discouragement go and really be energized by amplifying some of these voices. Because I mean, all across the board in media, there are publishing companies that are seeking manuscripts by Black authors now. There are mainstream media magazines who know that they don't have any freelancers of color, so they're trying to get more into their stables now. So I would just say, try not to really be discouraged by some of the progress that's not happening, and really be encouraged by having the opportunity to document all of this historic change. That's exciting to me right now, because what happened in this country this summer, what is happening now with this once in a several generation kind of lifetime pandemic, is that all of us are living through this and we have the opportunity to document it. So I think that's exciting, and I think that's encouraging, and hopefully that's something that'll keep you going.
Thank you. Now I'm going to move to Elie next. You're writing on the Supreme Court. Maybe this question was particularly aimed at you. How do you remain optimistic?
Yeah, I mean, Elliot has gotten to my existential crisis. At least once a week, I look at my screen and I think, there is no point. I'm writing right now about a topic that I am destined to lose, right? Like, I get that. I get that I'm not going to win this particular battle that I am fighting right now. I mean, Liliana, for God's sakes, she writes about people who are going to be killed, and they're going to be killed. The killing will not stop. There 210,000 people have died from COVID already. I can't stop that. I can't stop Amy Coney Barrett. I can't stop it, and it hurts every day, all the time. And I don't always feel like there is much of a point to it all. I often feel like I'm just screaming into the wind, into forces that will not relent. Where I end up, where I come back to it, and where I find the whatever to keep writing, is a little bit with what Sherri said. In my darkest moments, where I go back to is the sense that I have a duty, I have an opportunity, I have a privilege because I have a platform, and so I get to then write things that so many other people are feeling, that so many other people are saying, that so many other people desperately want to be heard, but they don't have my privilege, they don't have my platform, they don't have my access to an audience. And so I have to write for them, right? I have to keep trying to bring that voice and those stories and those issues to the fore, because, you know, my mother lives with us, and she watches, you know, cable news. She works full time, and then at night she watches cable news and she screams at the TV. I mean, just yells at Chris Hayes, why are you doing it that way? Oh, Chris Hayes, I love you because you did it that way. Like, she's kind of schizo, right? And every night she'll like, you should write about this. You should write about that. And you know what? She's not wrong, right? I have the opportunity to write what my mom does not have the opportunity to write. I have the opportunity to say and scream at the people that my mother does not have the opportunity to scream at. And that is what kind of keeps me back, it gets me back into the game, remembering that there are not that there are people counting on me, but there are people who don't have my opportunity and privilege, and that I have to try to speak for them. But it's hard. I'm not going to lie, Elliot. It is difficult right now.
And Elie, I think we probably all have parents who tell us what to write episodically. Zoe, you're up next.
Yeah, my mom really wanted me to write about some virus that's impacting deer in Minnesota recently. But yeah, what Elie said, I really agree with in terms of thinking about whose experience can be shared through my platform, and how is that useful to them, and or getting voices that we don't normally hear out into the world, or an experience that we often don't think about into the world. And seeing the impact of that sometimes is really delayed. Like, maybe the piece doesn't do well on Twitter and it feels like it's been a total failure, but then suddenly in a year there are a bunch more articles that come out about that issue, and then there's the snowball effect, and then there's policy change, or maybe it takes 50 years, or maybe, you know, it's really hard to trace impact sometimes. And sometimes there's an investigative piece and then the policy changes immediately, and that's the dream, right? That's the ideal. But I think for me, it's trying to think about the long-term trajectory of a conversation and how a single piece can contribute to that, or how you know, maybe you're just complicating an issue that people thought was very simple, and just making people think harder. And I think there's use in that too. And then the last thing is just trying to tell a good story. I think there's always value in storytelling when it's done well, and trying to bring that craft aspect to the work is a way that I can pull some pleasure back into it, even when it's about a really dire situation, or when it seems like it might not have much life online.
Thank you. And Liliana, the last word on this is going to go to you.
No pressure. It's hard to know how to add to that, because I would echo so much of what's been said. But I guess when it comes to my particular beat, it's interesting. When I was an intern at The Nation, and I was really passionate and fired up about criminal justice reform and the death penalty, I mean, it wasn't necessarily an issue that a lot of people were necessarily fired up about. We were in the midst of, you know, it was the Bush administration. We were talking about Guantanamo. We were talking about everything was sort of the context of the war on terror, and the sort of war on crime and the death penalty had sort of been shoved aside, I think, in some very big ways. And so for a long time, it sort of felt like I was just kind of, you know, I had this beat that felt a little unique. And then suddenly, over the past several years, we've seen this like incredible evolution of reporting and writing about criminal justice in a way that like has been kind of surreal to see. You know, we have the Marshall Project, we have the Appeal, we have just, this is a beat that so many people are drawn to now. And that's actually very exciting for me. You know, I try to keep my competitive instincts in check, because frankly, there are so many stories to tell, and we need people telling them, and we need people doing it right. And one of the most important sort of contributions and changes that have come about around this kind of new consciousness around these issues is that there are some, you know, in areas of mainstream media, we're seeing some practices questioned for the first time. Things like, you know, putting someone's mugshot on the front page of the newspaper. That's still pretty common, you know, in local journalism, but it's being questioned, it's being discussed, it's being changed. And I think that has everything to do with the kind of moment we're in around racial justice as well. And so that kind of keeps me going, despite this kind of the screaming into the void experience of trying to cover these federal executions, which has been truly surreal, because finally my beat intersects with Trump, like Trump, you know, who sort of swallowed knows everything is finally, he's doing something at the national level that I thought was going to be, it's like, all right, here's where I apply my knowledge and sort of expertise. And yet it's like, nobody's paying attention. There's too much else going on. So that can get me down. But I guess the other thing I would say, and I would end on, is that, early on, sort of when the post-George Floyd protests started, this kind of incredible movement started to happen nationally. I'm in Middle Tennessee. I live in Nashville. It's a little bit of a blue bubble, red state situation. But as in so many other parts of the country, Tennessee was just filled with all these like smaller protests that were popping up all over the state, and if you go from West Tennessee to East Tennessee, it's a pretty different demographic makeup. And a lot of people were really kind of enthralled by the protests that were happening in kind of majority white areas, because it's like these unlikely protesters coming out for racial justice, right? But I went out to West Tennessee, to a small town called Covington, sort of northeast of Memphis, and covered a Black-led march that passed right in front of the courthouse square where there's a Confederate monument. And it was the first, I was told, it was the first march of that kind in a generation, and this is a place where you really feel the legacy of slavery and lynching. That is embedded in the history of that place. And it was important, it was so important. And some of the demands weren't necessarily what you would hear, from like super like lefty people on Twitter, around sort of abolish the police or all of that. But people were speaking in their own way, on their own terms, and confronting the white power structure in that place. And that was incredibly thrilling to see and to cover. And again, I had to come in and really try to read up and learn the history of this place to do it right. But that kept me going for a while. And it wasn't just because it was my first reporting trip in months. It was genuinely exciting and important. And I knew it meant that something bigger is happening. And I think that should keep all of us going.
All right. Well, we are plumb out of time. I want to thank Sherri Williams, Elie Mystal, Zoe Carpenter, Liliana Segura. That was an absolutely marvelous panel. And I really, you nailed it for exactly why not only can we, but must we keep reporting during the pandemic. And I also want to thank the students, because your questions today from start to finish have been absolutely first rate. And they give me tremendous optimism about the future of this profession of journalism. And of course, thank you to the nation for hosting this. So I know you need to stretch before your next panel. I think you should go and stretch. And to everyone here, thank you again for participating.
Thank you.